I'm Sophia Chen, 29. My mother rolled her eyes the second I walked into that courtroom in downtown Riverside. Not just any eye roll, the kind that could power a small wind turbine, the kind that screams, "Oh great, here comes the family disappointment to embarrass us again." My father didn't even look up from his phone, just that familiar head shake that said everything about what they thought of me being there. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. They sat in the front row like they owned the place, my mother Evelyn in her perfectly pressed Chanel suit, my father Marcus adjusting his Rolex for the third time in 5 minutes. Classic Chen family behavior, all appearances, all image, all about maintaining their precious reputation in Riverside's elite social circles. But then something extraordinary happened. Judge Harrison looked up from his paperwork, and his expression went from routine boredom to complete shock. His eyes locked onto mine, and I watched recognition hit him like a lightning bolt. The pen slipped from his fingers and clattered onto his desk. "Wait," he said slowly, leaning forward in his chair. You're the lead cybersecurity expert who solved the Meridian banking hack. You're the one who testified before Congress about digital financial crimes." The entire courtroom went dead silent. You could practically hear the air conditioning humming. My parents' confident smirks vanished faster than ice cream on hot asphalt. My mother's mouth actually fell open, and trust me, Evelyn Chen's mouth never falls open. She'd rather die than show that kind of surprise in public. My father finally looked up from his phone, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and something that might have been panic. The prestigious corporate lawyer they'd hired, some hotshot named Bradley Whitmore from the most expensive firm in Riverside, started frantically shuffling through papers like he'd missed something crucial. See, here's what my parents had no idea about. While they spent the last decade telling anyone who'd listen that their youngest daughter was a disappointment, who wasted her potential, and chose computers over a real career, I'd been quietly building something extraordinary. They thought I was just some IT girl fixing printers and resetting passwords. They had no clue that I'd become one of the country's most sought-after cybersecurity specialists. No idea that Fortune 500 companies paid me 6 figures to protect their digital assets. No idea that I'd been called to testify before Senate committees about national cybersecurity threats. Why didn't they know? Because they never asked. Never called. Never visited. Never showed the slightest interest in my life once I chose a path they deemed beneath the Chen family standards. You see, in the Chen family empire, my father owns 3 luxury car dealerships and my mother runs an upscale interior design firm. Success only counted if it came with a prestigious title they could brag about at country club dinners. Doctor, lawyer, investment banker, maybe a high-level executive at a Fortune 100 company. Those were acceptable careers for a Chen. But cybersecurity? Computer programming? Digital forensics? That was playing with computers in their minds. Technical work was for other people's children, not for someone who graduated valedictorian from Riverside Academy and had early admission offers to Harvard, Yale, and Stanford. The irony was delicious. Here they were, suing me for my inheritance from Grandma Rose, my father's mother who'd left me her entire estate worth $2.8 million, claiming I'd manipulated a senile old woman. They'd hired the most expensive lawyer in town, called in favors from their wealthy friends, and strutted into that courtroom like they were about to demolish some naive little computer nerd. Instead, they'd just discovered their disappointing daughter was sitting across from a federal judge who personally knew my professional reputation. Judge Harrison continued staring at me with something approaching awe. "Ms. Chen, I have to ask, are you here as the defendant in Chen vs. Chen estate case?" "Yes, Your Honor," I replied calmly, though inside I was trying not to smile at my parents' horrified expressions. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Remarkable," he said, shaking his head. "I've read your congressional testimony on cryptocurrency fraud prevention. Brilliant work. And your analysis of the Meridian case was referenced in 3 federal court decisions." My mother looked like she might faint. My father had gone completely pale. Their expensive lawyer was now openly panicking, realizing he'd walked into a courtroom planning to destroy someone who apparently had the personal respect of the presiding judge. But none of them knew the real story yet. None of them understood what had really happened with Grandma Rose, or why she'd chosen to leave everything to me instead of her own son. They were about to learn that some battles aren't won by whoever has the most money or the best connections. Sometimes, they're won by whoever has the truth. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever felt underestimated by your own family. You'll definitely want to stick around for what happened next, because this courtroom showdown was about to get very interesting. Let me back up 6 months and tell you exactly how we got to this moment, and why my parents had no idea who I'd really become. So let me back up 6 months to when this whole mess started. It was a Tuesday morning in March when I got the call that changed everything. I was in my home office in Seattle. Yeah, I'd moved 1,200 miles away from Riverside for a reason, debugging a particularly nasty piece of malware that had infected a client's entire network. My phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize. Normally I'd let it go to voicemail, but something made me pick up. Sophia? This is Dr. Patricia Kellner from Riverside General Hospital. My stomach dropped. Hospitals don't call with good news. I'm calling about your grandmother, Rose Chen. She's listed you as her emergency contact. Emergency contact? That was news to me. But then again, maybe it shouldn't have been. Grandma Rose was the only family member who'd ever supported my career choices, the only one who understood why I'd chosen my own path instead of following the Chen family blueprint. What happened? I asked, my fingers automatically saving my work. She had a stroke yesterday evening. A severe one, I'm afraid. She's asking for you specifically. Can you come? I was on a plane to Riverside within 4 hours. Funny how quickly you can drop everything when someone who actually matters needs you. The last time I'd made this trip was 3 years ago for Christmas, a disaster where my parents spent the entire visit criticizing my lifestyle choices and wondering aloud when I'd get serious about my career. When I walked into Grandma Rose's hospital room, she looked so small in that bed. At 84, she'd always been this force of nature, sharp-minded, quick-witted, never backing down from anyone, including her own son when he was being ridiculous. Now she seemed fragile, but her eyes were still bright when she saw me. Sophia, sweetheart, she whispered, reaching for my hand. Her grip was surprisingly strong. I knew you'd come. Of course I came, Grandma. How are you feeling? She gave me that knowing look I remembered from childhood. Like I'm running out of time, and there are things I need to tell you. She glanced toward the door, making sure we were alone. Your parents don't know you're here yet, do they? I shook my head. I came straight from the airport. Good. We need to talk first. Her voice was getting stronger, more like the grandmother I remembered. Sophia, I'm proud of you. So proud. Do you know that? The words hit me harder than I expected. When was the last time a family member had said they were proud of me? Grandma. Let me finish. I know what Marcus and Evelyn say about your work. I know they think you've thrown your life away. But I've been following your career. I read about the Meridian Bank case in the Wall Street Journal. I saw your testimony on C-SPAN. She squeezed my hand. My granddaughter, protecting our country's financial systems. If that's not success, I don't know what is. I felt tears building up. You saw that? Every minute of it. And when that senator tried to dismiss your expertise because of your age, the way you handled him? Pure Chen determination. The good kind, not the stubborn kind your father inherited. We talked for 2 hours. She told me about the real estate investments she'd made over the decades, property in downtown Riverside that had skyrocketed in value. She told me about the stocks she'd bought in tech companies back in the 1990s when everyone said she was crazy. She'd quietly built a fortune while letting everyone assume she was just living on my grandfather's life insurance. Why are you telling me this? I asked. Her expression grew serious. Because I'm leaving it all to you, sweetheart. Every penny. The will is already written, witnessed, and filed with my attorney. I nearly fell off my chair. Grandma, you can't, Dad will. Your father will survive. He's got his businesses, his reputation, his precious social standing. But you? You chose a harder path. You chose integrity over image. You deserve to be rewarded for that choice. That's when my parents finally showed up. I heard my mother's voice echoing down the hospital corridor before I saw her, that particular tone she used when she was trying to sound concerned but was actually annoyed. Completely inappropriate that they didn't call us first. We're her immediate family, after all. My father's deeper voice rumbled in agreement. Exactly. And where is Sophia? Someone said she was on the emergency contact list, which makes no sense. They walked into the room like they owned it, my mother carrying an enormous flower arrangement that probably cost more than most people's rent. Both stopped short when they saw me. Sophia? My mother's voice carried that familiar note of disapproval. What are you doing here? She's here because I asked her to come, Grandma Rose said firmly, her voice suddenly much stronger. She's been taking care of things while you two were busy. My father frowned. Taking care of what things? Mom, you should have called us first. Should I have? When's the last time either of you visited me? Not for a holiday obligation, just visited. The silence that followed was deafening. My parents exchanged glances, and I could see them mentally calculating. We've been busy with the businesses, my father finally said. You know how it is. I know how it is for Sophia too, Grandma Rose replied. But she made time. What happened next was classic Chen family dynamics. My parents spent the next 3 days hovering around the hospital, suddenly very concerned about Grandma Rose's care, her comfort, her needs. They brought more flowers, expensive chocolates, talked loudly about potentially hiring private nurses. But I noticed they never actually talked to her. They talked at her, about her, around her. Never with her. Grandma Rose died peacefully in her sleep 2 weeks later. I was holding her hand when it happened. My parents were at a charity gala that they decided was too important to miss. The funeral was everything you'd expect from the Chen family, elaborate, expensive, and designed more for show than for grief. Half of Riverside's elite showed up to pay their respects. My parents played the grieving son and daughter-in-law perfectly, accepting condolences with just the right amount of dignified sorrow. I delivered the eulogy. Talked about a woman who taught me that success wasn't about impressing other people, it was about making a difference. That courage wasn't about being fearless, it was about being afraid and doing the right thing anyway. My parents nodded along like they agreed, but I could see the confusion in their eyes. This wasn't the grandmother they remembered. Or maybe it was, and they just never bothered to really know her. The will reading was scheduled for the following week. I almost didn't go. Part of me just wanted to get back to Seattle, back to my work, back to my life. But something made me stay. Good thing I did, because that's when everything went completely sideways. Have you ever had a moment when you realized your family had no idea who you really were? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because this story is just getting started, and the biggest shock was still coming. I was 29 years old, and I'd built my entire adult life around one simple principle: prove them wrong through excellence. While my parents were telling everyone at their country club dinner parties about their disappointing daughter who plays with computers, I was quietly becoming one of the most respected cybersecurity experts in the country. But let me start at the beginning, because understanding how I got here requires understanding what I was running from. Growing up as the youngest Chen meant growing up under a microscope. My older brother Kevin had followed the family script perfectly: Harvard MBA, marriage to a senator's daughter, partnership at a prestigious consulting firm by 28. My sister Miranda went the medical route, cardiothoracic surgeon at Riverside Medical Center, married to another surgeon, 2 perfect children who spoke 3 languages by age 5. Then there was me. The family wild card who announced at 17 that I wanted to study computer science. You'd think I'd told them I wanted to become a circus performer. My father actually laughed, not a happy laugh, but that dismissive chuckle he reserved for things he considered beneath serious consideration. Computer science, my mother had said, her voice dripping with the kind of concern you'd use if someone announced they had a mysterious rash. Sweetheart, that's technical work. That's not really appropriate for someone with your advantages. By advantages, she meant money, connections, and the Chen family name. In their world, those advantages were supposed to translate into prestigious careers that looked good at cocktail parties. Careers you could brag about to other wealthy families. But I'm good at it, I'd protested. Really good. I already know 6 programming languages, and I've been helping the school district fix their network security issues. My father waved his hand dismissively. Anyone can learn to fix computers, Sophia. We're talking about your future. Your career. Your life. That conversation set the tone for everything that followed. They agreed to pay for college, conditionally. I could study computer science for 1 year, and then I had to come to my senses and switch to something appropriate. Pre-med, pre-law, business, maybe international relations if I insisted on being unconventional. I went to Stanford with a plan, be so successful they couldn't ignore it anymore. I threw myself into my studies like my life depended on it, because in many ways, it did. I wasn't just studying computer science, I was proving a point. I maintained a 4.0 GPA while working part-time in the university's IT security department. I published research papers as an undergraduate. I won national programming competitions. My parents' response? Polite but distant interest. They'd ask about my grades, nod approvingly at the numbers, but never asked about the work itself. Never wanted to understand what I was actually doing. Junior year, I discovered cybersecurity. It was like finding a language I'd been born to speak. The intersection of technology, psychology, criminal investigation, and national security fascinated me in ways I couldn't explain. I started specializing, taking advanced courses, working with professors on research projects that had real-world implications. That's when I first caught the attention of federal agencies. It started small, a summer internship with the FBI's Cybercrime Division. Then a consulting project with the Department of Homeland Security. By my senior year, I was getting job offers from places I couldn't even tell my parents about due to security clearances. But my parents weren't impressed. They saw government work as stepping stone careers, something you did until you got a real job in the private sector. When I graduated summa cum laude with job offers from Google, Microsoft, and the NSA, they actually seemed disappointed that I was limiting myself to technology. It's fine for now, my mother would tell her friends, but eventually she'll move into management or start her own consulting firm. Something more substantial. I chose the NSA. Spent 3 years there working on projects I still can't discuss in detail, except to say that they involved protecting critical infrastructure from nation-state actors. It was the most important work I'd ever done, and the most challenging. My parents told people I worked for the government. They never mentioned what I actually did, probably because they didn't really understand it themselves. When I left the NSA to start my own cybersecurity consulting firm, they were relieved. Finally, they thought, she's becoming an entrepreneur. That was something they could understand and respect. What they didn't realize was that I wasn't just starting any consulting firm. I was launching a specialized practice focused on financial sector cybersecurity, with contracts from major banks and investment firms. Within 2 years, I was making more money than my surgeon sister, solving problems that kept CEOs awake at night. The Meridian banking hack changed everything. It was 2019, and someone had penetrated Meridian systems using a technique so sophisticated that their entire security team was baffled. The breach exposed customer data for 12 million accounts and nearly triggered a bank run. Meridian's CEO called me personally. "We need the best," he said. "Money is no object." I spent 4 months living essentially in Meridian's data centers, tracking the attackers through layers of digital deception that would have impressed professional intelligence agencies. When I finally traced the hack to a group of Eastern European cybercriminals working with insider help, the FBI called it one of the most complex financial cyber crimes they'd ever seen solved. The congressional testimony came 6 months later. The Senate Banking Committee wanted to understand how the attack had happened and how to prevent similar breaches. I spent 8 hours over 2 days explaining modern cyber threats to senators who struggled to understand email. That testimony made national news. Not because of political drama, but because it was the first time many Americans had heard someone explain cybersecurity in terms they could understand. I became the face of financial cybersecurity protection, the person other experts referenced, the one journalists called for quotes. My parents' reaction? They mentioned to a few friends that I'd been on C-SPAN. That was it. No congratulations, no pride, no acknowledgement that maybe, just maybe, I'd chosen the right path after all. But Grandma Rose had been watching. She'd recorded my testimony. She'd read every article about my work. She'd quietly followed my career with the kind of attention and pride my own parents had never shown. That's why, when the lawyer read her will 3 weeks after the funeral, what happened next shouldn't have been a complete shock. But it was. The will reading was held in the conference room of Whitman, Sterling and Associates, Riverside's most prestigious law firm. My parents arrived in their matching Mercedes, dressed like they were attending a board meeting. They brought my brother Kevin, probably for moral support or legal expertise. I came alone, in my rental car, wearing a simple black dress that probably cost less than my mother's handbag. Mr. Whitman was elderly, precise, and clearly uncomfortable with what he was about to read. He'd been Grandma Rose's attorney for 30 years and knew the family dynamics well enough to anticipate fireworks. Rose Chen was very specific about her wishes, he began carefully. She updated her will multiple times over the past 5 years, always with the same basic structure, but with increasingly detailed explanations for her decisions. My father leaned forward confidently. As the only son, he'd naturally assumed he'd inherit the majority of her estate. Maybe there'd be some token amounts for the grandchildren, but the bulk of her assets would flow to him. Mr. Whitman cleared his throat. To my son Marcus, who has built a successful business and needs no assistance from me, I leave my collection of first edition books and my wedding rings, with my love and hope that he will remember our good times together. My father frowned slightly. Books and jewelry? That seemed minimal. To my daughter-in-law Evelyn, I leave my china set and crystal collection, with gratitude for the years of family dinners and holidays. My mother's frown deepened. China and crystal were nice, but hardly what you'd expect from someone with a multi-million-dollar estate. Mr. Whitman paused, glanced at me, then continued. The remainder of my estate, including my real estate holdings, investment portfolio, savings accounts, and all other assets, I leave entirely to my granddaughter, Sophia Chen. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the air conditioning humming in the vents. Then my father exploded. What happened next would set the stage for the courtroom confrontation that began this whole story, and would reveal just how far my parents were willing to go when their assumptions about family, success, and worthiness were shattered by the truth. If you've ever been underestimated by people who should have known better, you'll want to hear what happened when the will reading turned into a family war. Don't forget to like and subscribe, because this is where things got really interesting. The explosion was immediate and volcanic. My father shot out of his chair like he'd been electrocuted, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and pure rage in the span of about 3 seconds. What do you mean, remainder of the estate? He demanded, his voice echoing off the conference room's mahogany walls. How much are we talking about here? Mr. Whitman adjusted his glasses nervously. The estate is valued at approximately $2.8 million, Mr. Chen. The number hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. My mother's mouth fell open, again, and this time she didn't bother closing it. My brother Kevin leaned back in his chair, whistling low under his breath. 2.8 million, my father repeated, his voice getting dangerously quiet. That was his negotiation voice, the one he used when he was about to destroy someone in a business deal. And you're telling me that my mother left all of it to Sophia? I sat there in stunned silence, trying to process what I'd just heard. $2.8 million. Grandma Rose had been worth nearly $3 million, and I'd had no idea. None of us had. There must be a mistake, my mother said, finally finding her voice. Marcus is the eldest child. The only child. This doesn't make sense. Mr. Whitman pulled out a thick folder. Mrs. Chen was very thorough in her estate planning. She also left letters explaining her decisions. Would you like me to read those as well? My father was pacing now, his expensive Italian shoes clicking against the hardwood floor. Yes, read the letters. There has to be an explanation. My mother she was 84 years old. She wasn't thinking clearly. The first letter was addressed to my father. My dear Marcus, if you are hearing this, it means I am gone and you are probably very upset about my decisions. I want you to know that I made these choices with a clear mind and a full heart. You have built a successful business empire. You have wealth, reputation, and everything you ever told me mattered to you. You don't need my money, you have proven you can make your own. But more importantly, in the years since your father died, you have shown me that success and family rank very differently in your priorities. You visit on holidays. You call on my birthday. You fulfill obligations, not relationships. That is your choice, and I respect it. But my money will go to someone who made different choices. My father's face had gone from red to pale to an alarming shade of purple. She was manipulated, he said through gritted teeth. Someone influenced her. This isn't like her. Mr. Whitman pulled out another letter. She anticipated that reaction. This next letter is addressed to anyone who questions my mental capacity. He began reading in his measured lawyer voice. Rose Chen, am writing this in the presence of Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, my physician of 15 years, and Dr. James Patterson, a neurologist who has conducted a comprehensive mental competency evaluation at my request. Both doctors will attest that I am of sound mind, clear judgment, and fully understand the implications of my decisions. I am making these choices because I have spent the last 5 years watching my family very carefully. I have observed who visits, who calls, who remembers important dates, who shows genuine interest in my life versus who shows up out of obligation. The results of this observation period have been both heartbreaking and illuminating. The room was dead silent except for the sound of my father's increasingly agitated breathing. But Mr. Whitman wasn't done. He pulled out a third letter, this one with my name on it. This final letter is for Sophia, to be read aloud in the presence of the family. He cleared his throat and began, My dearest Sophia, if you are hearing this, it means the others are probably very angry right now. Let them be angry. Anger is often what people feel when they're forced to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves. I want you to know why I chose you, and it has nothing to do with favoritism or manipulation. It has everything to do with pattern recognition. Over the past 5 years, you called me every Sunday. Not on holidays, not on birthdays, every Sunday. You asked about my health, my garden, my books, my opinions on current events. You listened to my stories about your grandfather, even though you'd heard them dozens of times. When I mentioned that my computer was running slowly, you drove 1,200 miles to fix it and spent 3 days teaching me how to use new software. When I fell in the grocery store parking lot last year, you were the first person I called, and you were on a plane within 4 hours. Your father visits twice a year. Your mother sends expensive flowers on holidays with generic cards. They fulfill obligations. You build relationships. That's the difference between duty and love, and it's why my money goes to someone who understands that wealth without relationship is just numbers on a bank statement. I felt tears building up, but I was also acutely aware that my family was staring at me like I'd personally orchestrated some elaborate con game. My father finally found his voice. Sunday phone calls don't entitle someone to a $3 million inheritance, especially when there's a son who's been part of this family his whole life. But that's just it, I said quietly, speaking for the first time since the will reading began. I wasn't trying to earn anything. I called because I loved talking to her. Oh, please, my mother snapped, her composure finally cracking. Don't play innocent, Sophia. You saw an opportunity with a lonely old woman and you took it. Kevin, who'd been silent this whole time, leaned forward. Wait a minute. How did Grandma Rose even accumulate that much money? Dad, did you know she was worth this much? My father shook his head grimly. I had no idea. She lived modestly. I thought she was comfortable, but not this comfortable. Mr. Whitman consulted his notes. Mrs. Chen was quite shrewd with her investments. She purchased several properties in downtown Riverside in the 1980s when prices were low. She also invested heavily in technology stocks in the 1990s, against the advice of her then financial advisor who called it too risky for a widow. Those investments appreciated considerably over the decades. The irony wasn't lost on me. Grandma Rose had believed in technology investments when the experts said it was foolish. She'd supported my technology career when my family said it was inappropriate. She'd seen potential where others saw risk. There has to be a way to contest this, my mother said, her business mind already working. Undue influence, mental incapacity, something. Mr. Whitman's expression grew even more uncomfortable. Mrs. Chen anticipated that as well. She had herself evaluated by 3 separate physicians over the past 2 years. She documented every conversation with family members. She kept detailed records of visits, phone calls, and interactions. She was, frankly, building a legal case to support her decisions. My father was pacing again, but now his movement had the focused energy of someone forming a plan. We'll see about that. Just because she documented things doesn't mean those documents tell the whole story. The meeting ended with my parents and brother storming out, leaving me alone with Mr. Whitman and a stack of paperwork that would apparently make me a millionaire. Miss Chen, Mr. Whitman said gently, your grandmother was very fond of you. But she was also very realistic about what would happen after this meeting. She advised me to recommend that you retain legal counsel immediately. I looked up from the inheritance documents. Do you think they'll actually contest the will? He gave me a look that was both sympathetic and pragmatic. Miss Chen, in my 40 years of practice, I've learned that money makes people do things they never thought they were capable of. Your grandmother left you a fortune, but she also left you a fight. That fight would begin exactly 30 days later, when my parents filed a lawsuit claiming that I had manipulated a vulnerable elderly woman into disinheriting her own son. They had no idea that the woman they thought was a computer nerd living paycheck to paycheck in Seattle was actually one of the most respected cybersecurity experts in the country. They had no idea that I'd testified before Congress, consulted for Fortune 500 companies, and earned the professional respect of federal judges. They were about to find out, and the discovery would turn their carefully planned legal strategy into a complete disaster. But before we get to that courtroom showdown, you need to understand how the battle lines were drawn and just how far my family was willing to go when they decided I didn't deserve what Grandma Rose had given me. If you've ever inherited something that others thought should have been theirs, drop a comment below. And make sure to subscribe, because what happened next proved that sometimes the people who underestimate you the most are the ones who end up paying the highest price for their assumptions. The 30 days following the will reading felt like living in a pressure cooker. I flew back to Seattle trying to process everything that had happened, but my parents weren't about to let me settle into my new reality peacefully. The phone calls started immediately. My father, using his most authoritative business voice, trying to convince me to do the right thing and share the inheritance fairly. My mother, alternating between guilt trips about family loyalty and thinly veiled threats about what would happen if I didn't cooperate voluntarily. Sophia, sweetheart, she'd say in that saccharine tone she used when she wanted something, surely you understand that this inheritance should benefit the whole family. Your grandmother was obviously confused in her final years. Kevin tried a different approach, the reasonable older brother routine. Look, Soph, I get that Grandma Rose loved you. But $2.8 million? That's life-changing money. Dad's got 2 kids in college, Miranda's got medical school loans to pay off. Maybe we could work out some kind of arrangement. I listened to their arguments, their justifications, their increasingly desperate attempts to convince me that keeping Grandma Rose's inheritance was somehow morally wrong. But here's what they didn't understand: I had never asked for any of this. I hadn't manipulated anyone or positioned myself for financial gain. I had simply loved my grandmother consistently, and she had chosen to reward that love. More importantly, I didn't need their money. My cybersecurity consulting firm was generating serious revenue. I owned a beautiful condo in Seattle with panoramic views of Puget Sound. I drove a Tesla, had a healthy investment portfolio, and could afford pretty much anything I wanted. The inheritance wasn't about improving my lifestyle, it was about validation. For the first time in my life, someone in my family had looked at my choices and said, "You did the right thing. You lived according to principles I respect. You deserve to be rewarded for that." But my parents saw the situation through their own lens, money and family hierarchy. In their world, the eldest son inherited. The eldest son made decisions about family assets. The eldest son represented the family legacy. A granddaughter, especially one who'd wasted her potential on computers, didn't fit their traditional power structure. 2 weeks after the will reading, I was in Portland consulting for a mid-sized bank when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. Professional habit made me answer. In my line of work, unknown numbers could be urgent security situations. Sophia Chen. This is Bradley Whitmore from Whitmore, Davidson and Associates. I knew that name. Riverside's most expensive law firm, the one my parents used for their business legal work. "Mr. Whitmore, what can I do for you?" His voice had that carefully modulated tone lawyers use when they're delivering bad news. They want to sound reasonable. "I represent Marcus and Evelyn Chen regarding the estate of Rose Chen. I'm calling as a professional courtesy to inform you that my clients will be filing a legal challenge to the will." My stomach dropped, even though I'd been expecting this call. On what grounds? Undue influence, mental incapacity at the time the will was executed, and improper isolation of the deceased from her immediate family members. I felt anger rising in my chest. "Mr. Whitmore, my grandmother was evaluated by 3 physicians. She was of sound mind, and she made her decisions based on years of observation. That may be your perspective, Miss Chen. However, my clients believe that a closer examination of the circumstances will reveal a pattern of manipulation designed to secure financial benefit." The legal language was polite, but the accusation was clear. They were calling me a con artist who had taken advantage of an elderly woman. "I see. And I suppose this has nothing to do with the fact that your clients just discovered my grandmother was worth nearly $3 million instead of the modest savings account they assumed she had?" There was a pause. "Miss Chen, I'd strongly recommend you retain legal counsel. This matter will be proceeding to court." I hung up and immediately called the one person I knew could handle this, Janet Rodriguez, a litigation attorney I'd worked with on several cybersecurity cases involving corporate fraud. If anyone could navigate a family inheritance dispute, it was Janet. "They're claiming what?" Janet's voice carried a mixture of disbelief and professional interest when I explained the situation. "Undue influence, mental incapacity, isolation from family. The whole playbook. Sophia, I've worked with you for 3 years. You're one of the most ethical people I know. You document everything, you follow protocols religiously, and you've never shown even a hint of the kind of manipulative behavior they're describing. I know that, and you know that. But they're going to paint a picture of a scheming granddaughter who saw an opportunity and took it." Janet was quiet for a moment. "Tell me about your grandmother's mental state. Was there any decline in her final years?" I thought back to my conversations with Grandma Rose, especially that last visit in the hospital. She was sharp as ever. She'd been following my career, reading about my congressional testimony, staying current on cybersecurity issues just so she could ask intelligent questions about my work. She was more mentally engaged than most people half her age. And the isolation claim? Ridiculous. I lived in Seattle. I called every Sunday and visited when I could, but I wasn't controlling who else she talked to or saw. If my parents want to claim I isolated her, they'll have to explain why they weren't visiting more often themselves. Janet's voice took on the focused tone I recognized from our professional collaborations. "Here's what's going to happen. They'll try to portray you as a manipulative opportunist who took advantage of family tragedy. We're going to present the truth. You're a successful professional who maintained a genuine relationship with your grandmother based on mutual respect and affection. Will that be enough?" "Sophia, inheritance disputes are ultimately about pattern and character. We need to show the court who you really are and what your relationship with your grandmother was actually like. That means we're going to need documentation, witnesses, evidence of your professional success, and proof that you didn't need this inheritance. That last point hit home. My parents and their expensive lawyer were operating under the assumption that I was some struggling tech worker who'd seen dollar signs when I realized Grandma Rose had money. They had no idea about my actual financial situation or professional reputation. Janet, there's something you should know. My parents don't really understand what I do for a living. They think I'm just a computer person. They have no idea about my government work, my congressional testimony, my client list, or my income level. I could practically hear Janet smiling through the phone. Oh, this is going to be fun. They're walking into court planning to demolish someone they think is vulnerable, but they're actually targeting one of the most respected cybersecurity experts in the country. Is that going to matter legally? It matters because it goes to motive. If you're already financially successful, their claim that you manipulated an elderly woman for money becomes much harder to prove. Why would someone with your income and professional status risk everything to con a family member? Over the next 2 weeks, we prepared for war. Janet requested my financial records, client testimonials, professional credentials, and documentation of my relationship with Grandma Rose. She interviewed character witnesses, requested medical records proving my grandmother's mental competency, and built a comprehensive picture of who I actually was versus who my parents thought I was. The most revealing part of the preparation was documenting the pattern of family interaction. Janet had me create timelines showing frequency of visits, phone calls, and meaningful contact between Grandma Rose and each family member over the past 5 years. The results were stark. My Sunday phone calls were documented in Grandma Rose's calendars. My visits were recorded in her journals. My professional achievements were carefully clipped and saved in a scrapbook she'd apparently been keeping for years. By contrast, my parents' interaction with her was sporadic, formal, and almost entirely centered around holidays and obligatory family events. There were months-long gaps with no contact at all. This isn't going to be a fair fight, Janet said as we reviewed the evidence. They're bringing emotion and entitlement to a battle that's going to be decided by facts and documentation. Your grandmother was methodical about record keeping, and those records tell a very clear story. The court date was set for 6 weeks later. Judge Harrison would preside, a detail that Janet found amusing when I mentioned my previous professional interaction with him. Wait, you've testified in front of the judge who's hearing your case? Not in front of him specifically, but he knows my professional reputation. He was familiar with my congressional testimony. Janet laughed. Your parents have no idea what they've walked into. They're expecting to intimidate some naive computer worker, and instead they're going to face someone with federal-level credentials and a judge who already respects your expertise. 3 days before the trial, my father made one last attempt at negotiation. He called while I was in my office reviewing Janet's trial preparation notes. Sophia, I want to make one final offer before this gets ugly in court. I'm listening. We'll settle for 60 to 40. You keep 60%, we get 40. That's still more money than you've ever seen, and it avoids a public family dispute. The audacity was breathtaking. He was offering to let me keep $1.7 million of my own inheritance as if he were doing me a favor. Dad, that's not how inheritance works. Grandma Rose left the money to me. All of it. The only reason we're going to court is because you decided to challenge her explicit wishes. She was manipulated, Sophia. I know you don't want to hear that, but an objective court is going to see that an old woman was taken advantage of by someone she trusted. We'll see about that, I said, and hung up. The next morning, I put on my best suit, reviewed my testimony notes one final time, and prepared to walk into that Riverside courtroom to defend not just my inheritance, but my character, my integrity, and my grandmother's final act of love. My parents had no idea they were about to discover exactly who their disappointing daughter had become. The lawsuit was filed on a Wednesday morning with all the drama my parents could muster. Bradley Whitmore held a press conference on the courthouse steps, positioning my family as victims of elder abuse and financial manipulation. The local Riverside Tribune ran the story with the headline, "Prominent Family Battles Inheritance Fraud Claims." Reading that article felt surreal. There was my professional headshot, Somehow they'd found my LinkedIn profile, next to quotes from Whitmore describing me as a tech worker who allegedly exploited her relationship with a vulnerable elderly woman for financial gain. The irony was thick enough to cut with a knife. While Whitmore was telling reporters about my supposed manipulation tactics, I was in Washington, D.C. briefing a Senate subcommittee on emerging cryptocurrency threats to the banking sector. While my parents were giving interviews about family values and proper inheritance protocols, I was working 18-hour days helping 3 different banks recover from sophisticated cyber attacks. But the most fascinating part of their legal strategy was how completely wrong they'd gotten the basic facts about my life. Their court filing painted a picture of someone desperate for money, living paycheck to paycheck, who had calculated that befriending her grandmother could result in financial gain. They claimed I had systematically isolated the deceased from her family and exploited her loneliness and mental decline for personal enrichment. Janet called me after reviewing their complete filing. "Sophia, this is either the worst legal research I've ever seen, or they genuinely have no idea who you are." "What do you mean?" "They're arguing that you needed this money, that you were financially vulnerable and saw an opportunity. But they haven't done any actual investigation into your income, your assets, or your professional status. Their entire case is built on assumptions." I was sitting in my Seattle office, looking out at the city skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows, thinking about the disconnect between their perception and my reality. They know I work in cybersecurity. They just don't understand what that means in terms of actual career success. That's going to be our advantage. When we demonstrate your actual income level and professional reputation, their motive theory collapses completely. The discovery process was enlightening in ways I hadn't expected. Whitmore's team requested my financial records, employment history, and tax returns, standard procedure for this type of case. What they weren't prepared for was what those documents would reveal. My tax returns showed annual income that exceeded what most people made in 5 years. My bank statements revealed investment accounts, real estate holdings, and business assets that painted a picture of someone who was already financially secure. My employment record included consulting contracts with Fortune 500 companies, government agencies, and international corporations. But the real bombshell came when Janet subpoenaed my parents' financial records as part of our counter-discovery. If they were going to claim I had improper motives for maintaining a relationship with Grandma Rose, we were going to examine their own financial relationship with her. The results were devastating to their case. Over the past 15 years, my father had borrowed money from Grandma Rose on 6 separate occasions. Business loans for expansion projects that hadn't materialized. Bridge financing for real estate deals that fell through. Emergency funds for cash flow problems during economic downturns. The total amount exceeded $400,000. Even more damaging were the email records Janet's investigators uncovered. Digital forensics, a specialty I was familiar with from my own work, revealed a pattern of my father asking Grandma Rose for money while maintaining minimal personal contact with her. One email from 3 years earlier was particularly damning. "Mom, we're having some temporary cash flow issues with the new dealership location. Could you help us out with a short-term loan? About $75,000 should cover it until the financing comes through. Love you, Marcus." Grandma Rose had replied, "Marcus, I'm happy to help, but I'm also concerned that this is the 4th time in 2 years you've needed emergency funds. Perhaps we should sit down and discuss your business strategy." My father's response, "Thanks for the money, Mom. I'll call you soon to set up a meeting." According to phone records, that call never happened. He deposited the check and didn't contact her again for 4 months. Janet was practically gleeful when she showed me these discoveries. "So let me get this straight. They're claiming you manipulated your grandmother for money, but your father borrowed $400,000 from her while barely maintaining contact. Meanwhile, you never asked her for anything financially, but you called every week just to talk." That's exactly right. This case is over before it starts. They've handed us everything we need to demolish their credibility. But my parents weren't backing down. If anything, the discovery process seemed to make them more determined to prove that somehow, despite all evidence to the contrary, I was the manipulative one in this situation. Whitmore's next move was to request depositions from character witnesses. They wanted to interview my colleagues, my clients, and anyone who could speak to my relationship with Grandma Rose. Janet was delighted to accommodate them. The first deposition was with Dr. Rebecca Martinez, the FBI's Deputy Director of Cybersecurity Operations and my former supervisor during my NSA years. Watching Whitmore try to frame questions about my character and integrity to someone who held one of the highest security clearances in the federal government was like watching a little league player try to pitch to a major league batter. Dr. Martinez, in your professional opinion, would you describe Miss Chen as someone capable of manipulation or deception? Dr. Martinez looked at him like he'd asked whether gravity was optional. Mr. Whitmore, Sophia Chen holds a top-secret security clearance with additional compartmentalized access. She's been entrusted with protecting national infrastructure from foreign adversaries. The psychological vetting process for someone in her position is more rigorous than what most Supreme Court justices undergo. If there were any indications of manipulative behavior or character issues, she would never have been cleared for the work she does. But surely, in a family context. Mr. Whitmore, the kind of psychological profile that allows someone to manipulate elderly relatives for money would absolutely disqualify them from cybersecurity work at her level. The personality traits are incompatible. The second deposition was with James Harrison, CEO of Meridian Banking, whose company I'd saved from the massive cyber attack. Whitmore tried to establish that maybe my professional success was exaggerated or that I might have financial pressures that would motivate inheritance manipulation. Mr. Harrison, what was Miss Chen's compensation for her work on the Meridian case? Her consulting fee was $450,000 for 4 months of work. I watched Whitmore's face go pale as he did the mental math. That was more money than most people made in 5 years, and it was just one contract from one client. And in your opinion, did Miss Chen demonstrate any concerning character traits during her work with your company? Harrison looked genuinely confused by the question. Mr. Whitmore, Sophia Chen saved our company from a cyber attack that could have resulted in hundreds of millions of dollars in losses and potential criminal liability. We've since hired her firm for ongoing security consulting. She's one of the most ethical and competent professionals I've ever worked with. By the time we finished depositions, Whitmore's case had been systematically dismantled. Every witness had testified to my professional competence, financial independence, and ethical behavior. Meanwhile, our counter-depositions had revealed the true pattern of family financial relationships. But my parents still weren't ready to concede defeat. 3 days before the trial was scheduled to begin, my mother called me personally. Sophia, this has gone too far. We're family. Family doesn't drag each other through court battles. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. Mom, you filed the lawsuit. You accused me of elder abuse and financial manipulation. You're the ones who dragged this into court. We were protecting your grandmother's memory. Protecting the family. You were protecting your assumption that you deserved money you were never entitled to. There was a long pause. When she spoke again, her voice had that dangerous edge I remembered from childhood arguments. Fine. If you want to do this the hard way, we'll do this the hard way. But don't expect this family to welcome you back after you've humiliated us publicly. Mom, I haven't humiliated anyone. I've just refused to give up an inheritance that was legitimately left to me by someone who made her decision based on 15 years of observing our family dynamics. We'll see what a judge thinks about that. She hung up, and I realized that the next time I saw my parents would be across a courtroom, where they would finally discover exactly who their disappointing daughter had become. The trial was set to begin on a Monday morning. Judge Harrison would preside, 12 jurors had been selected, and my parents would finally learn that sometimes the people you underestimate the most are the ones who end up surprising you in ways you never anticipated. Janet had one final strategy session with me the night before the trial began. Remember, Sophia, they're going to try to paint you as calculating and manipulative. But we have something they don't expect, the complete truth about who you are and what you've accomplished. Tomorrow, we get to show the court that their entire narrative is built on ignorance and assumptions. Are you confident? She smiled. Sophia, I've been practicing law for 20 years. I've never had a case where the opposing side was this wrong about this many basic facts. Tomorrow isn't going to be a trial. It's going to be an education. What my parents discovered when I walked into that courtroom would change our family dynamic forever, but more importantly, it would prove that Grandma Rose had chosen her heir based on character, accomplishment, and love, exactly as she'd intended. The courtroom preparation was meticulous. Janet and I spent the weekend before trial reviewing every document, every witness statement, every piece of evidence that would demolish my parents' carefully constructed narrative. But there was one element of our strategy that even Janet didn't fully appreciate until we began mock trial sessions. "Sophia, we need to talk about how you present yourself," she said during our final prep session. "Your parents are expecting the court to see someone they can dismiss as a naive computer worker. We need to make sure Judge Harrison and the jury understand exactly who they're really dealing with." I looked down at my conservative navy suit, the same type of professional attire I wore when testifying before Congress. "What do you mean?" "I mean that when you walk into that courtroom, you need to embody the authority and expertise you've earned. These people have spent years underestimating you. Tomorrow, we show them the cost of that mistake." Janet had arranged for character witnesses who would testify to my professional reputation, but she'd also prepared something more dramatic. With the court's permission, she'd requested to present evidence of my actual career accomplishments using multimedia displays, the same technology one used when briefing corporate executives and government officials. "We're going to show them your congressional testimony," she explained. "We're going to display client testimonials from Fortune 500 CEOs. We're going to present your income statements and professional credentials. By the time we're done, the jury will understand that their basic premise, that you needed this inheritance money, is completely false." The night before trial, I called my assistant in Seattle to make sure my consulting firm could function without me for however long this legal battle lasted. My business was generating enough revenue that I could afford to take time away, another fact that would demolish my parents' financial desperation theory. "How long do you think you'll be in court?" Sarah asked. "Janet thinks maybe a week, depending on how quickly the other side realizes their case is hopeless." "Good luck tomorrow. Though honestly, after working with you for 3 years, I can't imagine anyone successfully arguing that you're manipulative or dishonest. You're the most straightforward person I know." That straightforwardness was about to become crucial, because my parents and their expensive lawyer had built their entire legal strategy around a version of me that didn't exist. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn weather that made Riverside look like a postcard. I met Janet at the courthouse an hour early to review our opening strategy and prepare for what she described as the most lopsided inheritance case she'd ever handled. "Remember," she said as we walked through the courthouse corridors, "they're going to try to make you seem calculating and opportunistic. But every piece of evidence we present will show the opposite, someone who was already successful, already financially secure, and who maintained a relationship with her grandmother based on genuine affection." The courtroom was packed. Word had spread throughout Riverside's legal community that the Chen family inheritance dispute was going to be unusually dramatic. I recognized several faces from my parents' social circle, probably there to support them or simply satisfy their curiosity about family drama among the local elite. My parents sat at the plaintiff's table with Bradley Whitmore, looking confident and appropriately grief-stricken. They dressed for maximum sympathy, my father in his most conservative suit, my mother in understated black that suggested mourning rather than courtroom combat. They barely glanced at me when I entered with Janet. If anything, they seemed more assured than ever that they were about to expose their manipulative daughter and reclaim their rightful inheritance. Judge Harrison took the bench promptly at 9 o'clock. I watched his expression carefully as he reviewed the case files, wondering if he remembered our previous professional interaction. His face remained neutral, but I caught him glancing at me once with what might have been curiosity. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, "we're here to determine the validity of Rose Chen's will and the circumstances under which it was created. The plaintiffs claim that the deceased was unduly influenced by the defendant. The defendant maintains that the will represents the legitimate wishes of a competent woman who made informed decisions about her estate." Whitmore stood for his opening statement, and I had to admit the man was skilled. He painted a picture of a vulnerable elderly woman, isolated from her loving family by a granddaughter who saw financial opportunity in loneliness and grief. "Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about the exploitation of trust," he began, his voice carrying just the right amount of righteous indignation. Rose Chen was a widow who lost her beloved husband of 57 years. In her grief and isolation, she became dependent on the one family member who seemed to pay attention to her, her granddaughter Sophia. He gestured toward me with practiced sympathy. The defendant will try to convince you that she maintained this relationship out of love. But the evidence will show a calculated campaign to isolate Mrs. Chen from her son and daughter-in-law, to become indispensable to her daily life, and ultimately to manipulate her into changing her will. Whitmore was good, I had to give him that. He made it sound plausible, even sympathetic. A grieving grandmother, a lonely old woman, a scheming relative who took advantage of vulnerability. The defendant will present herself as a successful professional who didn't need this money, he continued. But we will show that appearances can be deceiving, that financial desperation can drive people to extreme measures, and that even family members can become predators when enough money is at stake. He spoke for 20 minutes, building a narrative that would have been compelling if it had any basis in reality. When he sat down, I could see some jury members nodding thoughtfully. He'd done his job, created doubt about my motives and character. Janet stood for our opening statement, and I could see the confidence in her posture that came from knowing she held all the winning cards. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Whitmore has just told you a story. It's a compelling story, a dramatic story, but it's not a true story. Over the next few days, we're going to show you the real facts about this case, and those facts will demonstrate that Rose Chen made her decisions based on careful observation, sound judgment, and clear evidence about who in her family actually valued relationship over obligation. Janet walked to the jury box, her voice taking on the conversational tone that made complex legal arguments accessible. You're going to learn that Sophia Chen is not a desperate granddaughter who manipulated an elderly woman for money. You're going to discover that she's one of the most successful cybersecurity experts in the country, someone who earns more in a single consulting contract than most people make in several years. I watched my parents' faces as Janet continued. My mother's confident expression was beginning to show cracks of uncertainty. My father was frowning, probably wondering where Janet was getting her information about my income. You're going to see congressional testimony where Sophia Chen advised United States senators on national cybersecurity policy. You're going to hear from Fortune 500 CEOs who trust her with their company's most sensitive digital assets. You're going to review tax returns that show someone who was already financially independent long before her grandmother's death. Janet paused, letting that information sink in with the jury. And then you're going to ask yourself the same question we've been asking. Why would someone with that level of professional success and financial security risk everything to manipulate an elderly relative for an inheritance she didn't need? The answer, of course, was that she wouldn't. No one would. The entire prosecution theory was built on a foundation of assumptions that were about to be systematically destroyed. Most importantly, Janet concluded, you're going to hear the truth about the relationship between Sophia Chen and her grandmother. Not a calculated manipulation, but a genuine bond between two people who respected each other's intelligence, independence, and integrity. Rose Chen didn't leave her money to Sophia because she was manipulated. She left it to her because Sophia was the only family member who treated her like a complete person instead of an obligation. When Janet sat down, the atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted. The jury was looking at me with curiosity now instead of suspicion. My parents were whispering frantically to Whitmore, probably demanding to know why he hadn't mentioned my apparent professional success during their case preparation. Judge Harrison looked at both legal teams. Mr. Whitmore, call your first witness. Your Honor, the plaintiffs call Marcus Chen. My father stood and walked to the witness stand with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. He was about to testify under oath about his relationship with his mother, his knowledge of my career, and his theories about inheritance manipulation. He had no idea that every word he spoke would be contradicted by documented evidence, financial records, and testimony from people whose professional credentials made his opinions irrelevant. The destruction of my parents' case was about to begin, and it would be even more thorough than Janet had predicted. What happened when my father took the stand would prove that sometimes the biggest mistake you can make is underestimating someone based on assumptions instead of facts. Make sure you're subscribed, because his testimony was about to reveal just how little my own family actually knew about the woman they decided to destroy in court. My father approached the witness stand with the swagger of someone who'd spent decades commanding boardrooms and closing million-dollar deals. He raised his right hand, swore to tell the truth, and settled into the witness chair like he was about to deliver a keynote presentation to his sales team. Whitmore began with softball questions designed to establish my father's credibility and paint him as the devoted son who'd been wrongfully disinherited. "Mr. Chen, please tell the court about your relationship with your mother, Rose Chen." My father's voice carried that practiced sincerity he used during television interviews for his dealership commercials. "My mother was everything to me. She raised me after my father died when I was 12 years old. She sacrificed everything to make sure I had opportunities, education, a chance to build something meaningful with my life." It was a compelling opening, delivered with just the right amount of emotion. The jury was listening intently, and I could see why Whitmore had chosen to lead with my father's testimony. Marcus Chen was an experienced public speaker who knew how to work a room. "How would you describe your relationship with her in her final years?" "We were very close. I visited regularly, called frequently, made sure she had everything she needed. She was proud of what I'd built, the businesses, the family, the reputation we'd established in Riverside. I thought she understood that I was carrying on the family legacy she and my father had started." Whitmore nodded sympathetically. "When did you first become aware that your daughter Sophia was spending unusual amounts of time with your mother?" My father's expression darkened slightly. "It started after my mother's husband, my stepfather, passed away about 8 years ago. Sophia began calling more frequently, visiting when she was in town. At first, I thought it was nice that she was paying attention to her grandmother. When did that change? Gradually, I began to notice that my mother's perspective on family matters was changing. She became critical of my business decisions, questioning choices I'd made about family finances. She started suggesting that maybe success wasn't just about money and reputation." I watched the jury carefully as my father continued. He was painting a picture of a grandmother who'd been influenced to turn against her successful son in favor of a granddaughter who filled her head with different ideas about what mattered. "Did you observe any specific instances where Sophia seemed to be influencing your mother's opinions?" "Several times. Sophia would make comments about corporate responsibility, about whether businesses had obligations beyond profit. She'd talk about public service, about using skills for societal benefit rather than just personal advancement. My mother started repeating these ideas, questioning whether I was making the right choices." Whitmore was building toward his central theory, that I had gradually poisoned my grandmother's mind against her own son by promoting different values and priorities. "Mr. Chen, what was your understanding of Sophia's financial situation?" This was the question that would expose just how little my father actually knew about my life. "Sophia works in computers. Information technology, I think. She's got a decent job, probably makes a comfortable living, but nothing extraordinary. She's never been particularly ambitious about building wealth or establishing herself professionally in any meaningful way." I felt Janet shift beside me. My father had just testified under oath that I was financially ordinary, someone who might be motivated by a multi-million-dollar inheritance. His entire credibility was about to be demolished by tax returns and professional documentation. "In your opinion, might your daughter have been motivated by financial considerations in cultivating her relationship with your mother?" "Objection," Janet said calmly. "Calls for speculation." "I'll rephrase," Whitmore replied. "Based on your knowledge of Sophia's financial situation, would a substantial inheritance represent a significant change in her lifestyle?" My father nodded emphatically. "Absolutely. $2.8 million would be life-changing money for someone in Sophia's position. More money than she'd ever seen or could expect to earn." I had to bite my lip to keep from laughing. My annual income from consulting contracts alone exceeded what my father thought would be life-changing money for me. Whitmore continued building his case through my father's testimony, establishing a timeline of my supposedly increasing influence over Grandma Rose, documenting instances where she'd seemed to adopt my perspectives on family and success, painting a picture of gradual manipulation culminating in a will that disinherited the rightful heir. My father was an effective witness because he genuinely believed everything he was saying. From his perspective, I was a moderately successful computer worker who had somehow convinced his mother to leave me a fortune I didn't deserve. His conviction made his testimony compelling, even though it was built entirely on false assumptions. After 45 minutes of direct examination, Whitmore sat down looking satisfied. He presented a coherent narrative of family manipulation that might convince a jury, if they didn't have access to the complete facts about my actual life and career. Judge Harrison looked at Janet. Cross-examination? Janet stood with the demeanor of someone about to enjoy herself immensely. Thank you, Your Honor. She approached my father with a stack of documents in her hand. Mr. Chen, you testified that you have a close relationship with your daughter Sophia. Is that accurate? Yes, of course. When was the last time you visited her home? My father paused, clearly not expecting this question. Well, she lives in Seattle. It's not easy to travel that distance regularly. I'm not asking about regular visits. I'm asking when you last visited her home. Once? Ever? I don't see how that's relevant. I'll take that as never. Have you ever seen her office? No. Have you ever met any of her professional colleagues? No, but... Have you ever asked her about her specific job responsibilities, her clients, or her income? My father was beginning to look uncomfortable. We don't typically discuss business matters in detail during family conversations. Janet nodded as if this was exactly the answer she'd expected. So your testimony about her financial situation and career prospects is based on assumptions rather than actual knowledge. I know my daughter. Do you? Mr. Chen, what is your daughter's current annual income? I object, Whitmore called. Relevance? Your Honor, the witness has testified that the defendant would be motivated by money because of her modest financial circumstances. I'm testing the foundation of that testimony. Judge Harrison nodded. Overruled. The witness may answer. My father shifted uncomfortably. I don't know her exact income, but computer work generally pays decently. Maybe 70,000 a year. Janet looked genuinely delighted. 60 or 70,000. And you're certain about this assessment? I'm estimating based on her profession and experience level. Janet walked to the evidence table and picked up a document. Your Honor, I'd like to introduce Defense Exhibit A, Ms. Chen's tax return from last year. She handed a copy to my father. Mr. Chen, would you please read the adjusted gross income line to the jury? My father stared at the document, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and something approaching shock. $847,000, he read quietly. I'm sorry, could you repeat that for the jury? $847,000. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Several jury members leaned forward in their seats. My mother, sitting at the plaintiff's table, looked like she'd been physically slapped. Janet wasn't finished. And Mr. Chen, that's just from 1 year. Would you like me to show you her tax returns from the previous 3 years? I don't understand how. The truth is, Mr. Chen, you don't actually know what your daughter does for a living, do you? You don't know her clients, her expertise area, or her professional reputation. My father was struggling to regain his composure. She works with computers. She's one of the country's leading cybersecurity experts, Janet said matter-of-factly. She's testified before Congress, consulted for major corporations, and works on national security issues. But you wouldn't know that, because you've never asked. The devastation was complete. My father's entire testimony about my motives had been based on ignorance about the most basic facts of my adult life. Every assumption about my financial desperation had been destroyed by a single tax document. Janet continued her cross-examination for another 20 minutes, systematically dismantling my father's credibility by demonstrating how little he actually knew about either my life or my relationship with Grandma Rose. By the time she was finished, it was clear that my father was testifying from assumptions rather than knowledge. When he stepped down from the witness stand, my father avoided eye contact with me entirely. For the first time in my life, Marcus Chen looked uncertain, diminished, forced to confront the reality that he'd built his entire understanding of his family on foundations that had just crumbled beneath him. But Whitmore wasn't ready to give up. He still had my mother's testimony, and he was banking on the idea that emotional appeals about family loyalty might resonate with the jury even if the financial motive had been destroyed. He had no idea that my mother's testimony would be even more damaging to their case than my father's had been. The systematic destruction of my parents' assumptions was just getting started, and what came next would prove that sometimes the people who think they know you best are the ones who know you least of all. After my father's testimony had been systematically dismantled, there was a lunch recess that felt more like a ceasefire than a break. I watched my parents huddle with Whitmore in urgent conversation, probably trying to salvage a legal strategy that had just been exposed as fundamentally flawed. Janet and I grabbed sandwiches from a deli across from the courthouse, but I was too nervous to eat much. How bad was that for them? I asked. Catastrophic, Janet replied, taking a bite of her turkey sandwich. Your father just testified under oath that you're financially desperate, and we proved he doesn't know the first thing about your actual income or career. But they're not going to give up. Your mother's testimony is their last chance to make an emotional appeal to the jury. When court reconvened, Whitmore called my mother to the stand. Evelyn Chen approached the witness chair with the regal bearing of someone accustomed to charity galas and country club leadership roles. She wore a simple black dress that managed to suggest both mourning and dignity, and her makeup was perfectly applied to look natural while highlighting her best features. If my father had been the aggressive businessman trying to dominate the courtroom, my mother was the grieving daughter-in-law seeking justice for a beloved family matriarch. Mrs. Chen, Whitmore began, his tone gentler than it had been with my father, please tell the jury about your relationship with Rose Chen. My mother's voice carried just the right amount of emotion, controlled grief with undertones of genuine affection. Rose was more than a mother-in-law to me. She was my mentor, my friend, my guide through 30 years of marriage and family building. When I married Marcus, I was a young woman with big dreams but very little practical knowledge about managing a household or raising children. Rose taught me everything. It was a compelling opening, and I could see the jury responding positively to my mother's obvious sincerity. Unlike my father's business-focused testimony, my mother was speaking about emotional bonds and family relationships. How would you describe Rose's mental state in her final years? She was struggling, my mother said, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. The loss of her second husband hit her very hard. She'd been married for almost 60 years, and suddenly she was alone in that big house with nothing but memories. She became dependent on routine, on familiar voices, on anyone who would listen to her stories about the past. Whitmore nodded sympathetically. Did you observe any changes in her behavior or judgment during this period? She became fixated on certain ideas, certain people. She'd always been independent and strong-willed, but after she became widowed, she started making decisions that seemed impulsive. Out of character for someone who had always been so careful and methodical. My mother was painting a picture of cognitive decline without explicitly claiming incompetence. Suggesting that grief had made Grandma Rose vulnerable to influence, susceptible to ideas that she wouldn't have entertained in her younger, sharper years. Mrs. Chen, can you describe how Sophia's relationship with her grandmother evolved after her grandfather's death? This was where my mother's testimony became truly damaging, or would have been, if it were accurate. Sophia started calling constantly. Every few days, then daily, then multiple times per day. She'd engage Rose in long conversations about politics, about social issues, about whether successful people had obligations to society. She introduced ideas that Rose had never expressed before. My mother's voice took on a note of concern that felt genuine. Rose started questioning Marcus's business practices, wondering whether he was contributing enough to the community. She began talking about meaningful work and public service in ways that sounded exactly like things Sophia would say. Whitmore guided my mother through a detailed account of my supposedly manipulative behavior. According to her testimony, I had gradually isolated Grandma Rose from the rest of the family by becoming her primary source of intellectual stimulation and emotional support. She started declining invitations to family events, my mother continued. Said she was too tired, or the timing wasn't good. But then we'd find out that Sophia had visited that same weekend, or that they'd spent hours on the phone discussing current events or Rose's investments. The picture my mother painted was of a lonely widow who'd become emotionally dependent on the one family member who seemed to pay attention to her, gradually adopting that person's worldview and ultimately making financial decisions based on manipulated loyalties rather than sound judgment. Mrs. Chen, in your opinion, was Rose competent to make complex financial decisions in her final years? Objection, Janet called. The witness is not qualified to offer medical or psychological opinions. Sustained, Judge Harrison ruled. Whitmore tried a different approach. Based on your observations, did Rose seem like the same person who had made careful, independent decisions throughout her life? My mother paused, clearly considering her answer carefully. She seemed confused about relationships. About who had been there for her over the years. She talked about Sophia like she was the only family member who cared about her, which was heartbreaking because Marcus and I had been visiting, calling, including her in family events for decades. This was where my mother's testimony became genuinely emotional, and I could see that her tears were real. From her perspective, perhaps she really did believe that I had somehow poisoned Grandma Rose's perception of the family dynamics. The woman who raised my husband, who helped me learn to be a wife and mother, who celebrated every holiday with us for 30 years, that woman would never have cut her only son out of her will. The Rose I knew understood family loyalty, understood that children and grandchildren might have different perspectives but that blood relationships were sacred. My mother's direct examination lasted nearly an hour, and by the end, she had painted a compelling portrait of a grieving widow who had been gradually manipulated by a granddaughter with radical ideas about family, success, and social responsibility. If the jury hadn't already heard about my actual income and professional reputation, her testimony might have been devastating. As it stood, she was describing someone who sounded nothing like the cybersecurity expert who earned nearly $1 million annually and testified before Congress. When Whitmore finished, Judge Harrison called for a brief recess before cross-examination. Janet used the time to review her notes and prepare for what she described as the most important 20 minutes of the trial. Your mother is a much more effective witness than your father, she told me during the break. She genuinely believes what she's saying, and she's articulating it in a way that could resonate emotionally with the jury. But it's not accurate. I know that, and you know that. Now we have to prove it. When court reconvened, Janet approached my mother with a respectful demeanor that acknowledged her obvious grief while preparing to challenge the foundation of her testimony. Mrs. Chen, you've testified about your close relationship with Rose Chen. I'd like to explore that relationship in more detail. Janet pulled out a calendar from her evidence stack. This is Rose Chen's personal calendar from her final year of life. She documented visits, phone calls, and significant events. According to this calendar, how many times did you visit her home in the 12 months before her death? My mother looked at the calendar with obvious confusion. I don't remember exactly. Several times. According to her records, you visited 4 times. Christmas, Easter, her birthday, and 1 additional weekend in July. Does that sound accurate? We also called regularly. How regularly? Weekly? Monthly? Well, we were busy with our own lives, but we stayed in contact. Janet consulted another document. Rose's phone records show 3 calls from your number in the 6 months before her death. 3 calls, Mrs. Chen. Does that match your recollection of regular contact? The systematic destruction of my mother's credibility was beginning, and it would prove even more thorough than what had happened to my father. Because unlike my father's ignorance about my career, my mother's claims about her relationship with Grandma Rose could be verified through documented evidence that Grandma Rose herself had maintained. What came next would reveal not just how little my parents knew about my life, but how little they had actually been involved in Grandma Rose's life during her final years. The truth about family relationships was about to be exposed through calendars, phone records, and the meticulous documentation of a woman who had apparently known exactly what kind of legal challenge might emerge after her death. Janet's cross-examination of my mother was surgical in its precision. Where my father had been destroyed by his ignorance about my professional life, my mother was about to be demolished by documented evidence about her actual relationship with Grandma Rose. Mrs. Chen, you testified that you had a close, mentoring relationship with Rose Chen. Let's examine what that looked like in practical terms. Janet approached the witness stand with a thick folder of documents. I have here Rose Chen's personal journals from the last 5 years of her life. She was quite meticulous about recording family interactions, visits, phone calls, and her observations about family relationships. My mother's confident expression began to show cracks of uncertainty. I don't understand what journals have to do with. Let me read you an entry from Christmas 2 years ago, Janet interrupted gently. Marcus and Evelyn came for dinner. Stayed exactly 2 hours. Evelyn spent most of the visit on her phone dealing with a client emergency. Marcus watched football in the den. Neither asked about my health, my activities, or my thoughts on anything meaningful. They brought expensive gifts that felt more like obligations than expressions of love. I felt like a checkbox on their holiday schedule. The courtroom was dead silent. My mother's face had gone pale, and I could see her struggling to maintain composure. Janet continued. Here's another entry from last spring. Called Evelyn to ask if she wanted to see the garden. She said she was too busy with the interior design business but would try to visit soon. That was 6 weeks ago. Still haven't heard from her. Meanwhile, Sophia called yesterday just to tell me about an interesting article she read about cybersecurity in healthcare. We talked for an hour about technology, ethics, and social responsibility. She listens to my opinions like they matter. Each journal entry was like a precision strike against my mother's carefully constructed testimony. Grandma Rose had been documenting the reality of our family relationships with the thoroughness of someone who understood that her observations might someday need to serve as evidence. Mrs. Chen, you testified that you included Rose in family events for decades. Can you tell me about the last family event Rose attended? My mother fidgeted with her hands. There were several events. Holiday dinners, birthday celebrations. According to her calendar, the last family event Rose attended was Kevin's wedding 3 years ago. She noted that she felt like a stranger at her own grandson's wedding because no one included her in conversations or seemed interested in her presence. Does that match your recollection? She could have been more social at family events. She chose to sit by herself. Janet pulled out another document. Let me read her observation about that wedding. Marcus and Evelyn seated me at a table with people I barely knew. They were too busy networking and socializing to spend time with me. I watched them work the room like it was a business function. Sophia was the only family member who sat with me, introduced me to her friends, and made sure I felt included. The difference in how they treat family obligations versus family relationships is stark. The systematic destruction continued for another 15 minutes. Janet presented documented evidence of my parents' minimal contact with Grandma Rose, their pattern of treating family visits like business obligations, and their consistent failure to engage with her as a complete person rather than an elderly relative to be managed. But the most damaging evidence came when Janet addressed my mother's claims about my supposed manipulation. Mrs. Chen, you testified that Sophia introduced radical new ideas about social responsibility and meaningful work that influenced Rose's thinking. Are you aware that Rose Chen was a founding member of the Riverside Community Foundation? Yes, but are you aware that she volunteered at literacy programs for underprivileged adults for over 20 years? I suppose. Are you aware that she established a scholarship fund for first-generation college students from low-income families, and that she'd been donating to social justice organizations since the 1970s? My mother was clearly struggling now. I didn't know about all of those activities. So when you testified that Sophia introduced ideas about public service and social responsibility, you were unaware that Rose had been committed to those principles for decades before Sophia was even born? The revelation hit the courtroom like a thunderbolt. My supposed manipulation had consisted of having conversations about values that Grandma Rose had held and practiced for most of her adult life. I hadn't changed her worldview, I had connected with it. Janet wasn't finished. Let me read one more journal entry, from just 3 months before Rose's death. Had a wonderful conversation with Sophia about the responsibility that comes with privilege and education. She understands intuitively what I've been trying to teach this family for years, that success without service is empty, that wealth without wisdom is meaningless. She chose a career protecting others rather than just enriching herself. She embodies the values I've tried to instill in this family. Marcus and Evelyn measure success by money and status. Sophia measures it by impact and integrity. That's why my money should go to someone who already understands what money is really for. The courtroom was absolutely silent except for the sound of my mother trying not to cry. Every argument about manipulation, undue influence, and cognitive decline had been systematically destroyed by Grandma Rose's own words, written in her own hand, documenting her own clear-minded observations about our family dynamics. Judge Harrison called for a brief recess. As the jury filed out, I caught my mother's eye for the first time since the trial began. She looked broken, not just by the legal defeat, but by the realization that she'd been completely wrong about the woman who had supposedly been manipulated. When court reconvened, Janet called me to the stand. This was the moment I'd been preparing for, the chance to tell my own story, to explain my relationship with Grandma Rose in my own words, and to demonstrate the character and competence that had earned her trust and respect. Please state your name and age for the record. Sophia Chen, 29 years old. What is your profession? I'm a cybersecurity consultant specializing in financial sector protection and national infrastructure security. Janet walked me through my educational background, my government service, my congressional testimony, and my current professional responsibilities. With each answer, I could see the jury's understanding shifting. This wasn't a desperate granddaughter who'd manipulated an elderly woman. This was a highly accomplished professional who'd built a career around protecting others. Sophia, can you describe your relationship with your grandmother? I took a breath, thinking about how to capture 30 years of love, respect, and genuine connection. My grandmother was my intellectual companion and my moral compass. She was brilliant, principled, and curious about everything. We talked about current events, technology, ethics, literature, politics. She had opinions about everything and she expected me to defend my positions with evidence and reasoning. Did you ever discuss her financial situation or her will? Never. I had no idea she was worth nearly $3 million until the will reading. I assumed she was comfortable but not wealthy. We never talked about inheritance, estate planning, or what would happen after her death. Why do you think she left her estate to you? I considered the question carefully. I think she left it to me because I treated her like a complete person rather than an obligation. I was interested in her thoughts, her opinions, her experiences. I valued her wisdom and sought her advice. I didn't visit out of duty, I visited because I genuinely enjoyed her company and respected her intelligence. Janet questioned me for 40 minutes, establishing not just my innocence of manipulation, but my character, my success, and my genuine love for Grandma Rose. By the time she finished, the jury was looking at me with respect rather than suspicion. Whitmore's cross-examination was brief and ineffective. He tried to suggest that my professional success somehow made me more capable of manipulation, but the argument fell flat. He attempted to characterize my conversations with Grandma Rose as calculated influence campaigns, but I was able to provide specific examples of discussions where we disagreed or where she had changed my mind rather than the reverse. After my testimony, Janet called character witnesses who testified to my professional reputation, my ethical standards, and my financial independence. Dr. Rebecca Martinez from the FBI spoke about the rigorous background checks required for my security clearance. James Harrison from Meridian Banking testified about my integrity during the cybersecurity crisis. 3 different colleagues described someone whose character was fundamentally incompatible with the manipulation my parents alleged. By the end of our case presentation, the jury had heard from federal law enforcement officials, Fortune 500 CEOs, and congressional staff members who all testified to my professional competence and ethical character. They had seen tax returns proving my financial independence and personal journals documenting the true nature of my relationship with Grandma Rose. When both sides rested their cases, Judge Harrison looked at the jury with the expression of someone who had witnessed a complete legal evisceration. Ladies and gentlemen, you've heard extensive testimony about the relationship between Rose Chen and her granddaughter Sophia. You've seen financial records, personal journals, and professional credentials. Your job is to determine whether Rose Chen's will represents her genuine wishes or the result of undue influence. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. When they returned to the courtroom, the foreman stood with a verdict that would officially validate everything Grandma Rose had written in her final letter to me, that love and presence matter more than blood and tradition, that character and integrity deserve to be rewarded, and that sometimes the people who know you least are the ones who assume they can control you most. The jury filed back into the courtroom with the kind of solemn efficiency that suggested they hadn't needed much time to reach their decision. I watched their faces carefully, trying to read any hint of what they'd concluded, but they maintained the neutral expressions that jurors are trained to show during verdict announcements. Judge Harrison looked at the foreman, a middle-aged woman who'd been taking extensive notes throughout the trial. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" "We have, Your Honor." "Please read the verdict." The foreman cleared her throat and looked directly at my parents before speaking. "In the matter of Chen versus Chen, regarding the estate of Rose Chen, we find that the will dated March 15 represents the genuine wishes of a competent testator, executed without undue influence or manipulation." The silence that followed was deafening. Then Judge Harrison's gavel came down with a sharp crack that seemed to echo through the entire courthouse. "The will stands as written. The plaintiff's petition is denied." My mother let out a sound that was part sob, part gasp. My father sat frozen in his chair, staring at the jury like he couldn't process what he'd just heard. Whitmore was already shuffling papers, probably calculating how quickly he could distance himself from this legal disaster. But Judge Harrison wasn't finished. Furthermore, given the frivolous nature of this challenge and the clear evidence that the plaintiffs proceeded without conducting adequate investigation into the basic facts of their case, I am awarding attorney's fees and court costs to the defendant. The plaintiffs will be responsible for all legal expenses incurred in defending against this baseless action. That final ruling was like adding insult to injury. Not only had my parents lost their inheritance challenge, but they would have to pay for the privilege of being publicly humiliated in court. Janet leaned over to whisper in my ear. "Congratulations. It's over." But as I looked at my parents' devastated faces, I realized that while the legal battle was over, the family reckoning was just beginning. As the courtroom began to empty, my father finally stood and walked over to me. His face was a mixture of anger, confusion, and something that might have been respect. "Sophia," he said quietly, "we need to talk." "I don't think we do, Dad. Everything that needed to be said was said in court. Please. 5 minutes. Just give me 5 minutes." Against my better judgment, I followed him into the courthouse corridor. My mother was crying quietly while Kevin tried to comfort her, and Whitmore was making a hasty exit with his briefcase. "I had no idea," my father began, his voice barely above a whisper. "About your career, your income, your success. Why didn't you tell us?" I stared at him in disbelief. "Why didn't I tell you? Dad, when was the last time you asked me about my work? About my life? About anything that mattered to me? We always assumed. You assumed I was a failure because I didn't follow your definition of success. You assumed I was struggling because I chose technology over traditional prestige careers. You never bothered to find out what I was actually accomplishing." My father ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I remembered from childhood when he was frustrated with business problems. The congressional testimony, the Fortune 500 consulting, the security clearances. How long has this been going on? Years, Dad. Years. While you were telling people at your country club that your daughter plays with computers, I was protecting national infrastructure from foreign attacks. While you were explaining to your friends that I'd wasted my potential, I was earning more money than both of your dealerships combined. The impact of these revelations was clearly overwhelming him. But why didn't Grandma Rose tell us? Why didn't she mention your success? Because you never asked her about me either. You visited twice a year, stayed for a few hours, and treated those visits like business obligations. She tried to tell you about my achievements, about the articles she'd read, about the testimony she'd watched. You weren't interested. My mother approached us, her makeup ruined by tears but her composure somewhat restored. "Sophia, please, can we try to fix this? Can we try to be a family again?" The question hung in the air between us, loaded with 30 years of missed opportunities and fundamental misunderstandings about what family relationships require. Mom, you just spent 3 months publicly accusing me of elder abuse and financial manipulation. You hired lawyers to prove that I was a con artist who took advantage of a vulnerable old woman. You testified under oath that I was manipulative and calculating. We were wrong, she whispered. We were completely wrong about everything. Yes, you were. But more than that, you were wrong because you never bothered to know me. You created a version of me that fit your assumptions and then attacked that fictional person in court. My father tried again. What would it take? What would it take for us to rebuild some kind of relationship? I thought about Grandma Rose's journals, about her observations of family dynamics, about her clear-eyed assessment of who valued relationships versus who fulfilled obligations. I don't know if that's possible, I said honestly. For 30 years, you've treated me like a disappointment because I didn't match your image of success. You've ignored my actual accomplishments while criticizing choices you never understood. You've maintained minimal contact with me and even less with Grandma Rose, then claimed we were the ones who were manipulative. People can change, my mother said desperately. Can they? Because 3 hours ago, you were still convinced I was a manipulative fraud. The only thing that changed your mind was overwhelming evidence presented in a public courtroom. If we hadn't gone to trial, you'd still believe I was a scheming granddaughter who conned an elderly woman. Kevin, who had been silent during this conversation, finally spoke up. Sophia, we're family. That has to count for something. I looked at my older brother, the golden child who'd followed every rule and met every expectation. Kevin, Grandma Rose was family too. But you visited her maybe twice in the last 5 years. You called her on her birthday and Christmas, if you remembered. Family isn't just a biological connection, it's a choice you make every day to show up for people. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, with my parents alternating between apologies, justifications, and desperate attempts to find some path back to a relationship. But every word they spoke reinforced the fundamental truth that had led to this courtroom confrontation. They were more concerned with family hierarchy and their own assumptions than with actually knowing or understanding the people they claimed to love. Finally, I ended the discussion the same way Grandma Rose had ended her relationship with them, by choosing to prioritize people who actually valued my presence over people who only appeared when they wanted something. I'm going back to Seattle tomorrow, I told them. I'm going to continue my work, my life, and my relationships with people who actually know who I am. If you want to rebuild something with me, you'll have to prove that you're capable of seeing me as I actually am rather than as who you think I should be. I walked away from them in that courthouse corridor, leaving them to process the reality that their assumptions about success, family, and worthiness had just cost them not only a multi-million-dollar inheritance, but any remaining relationship with the daughter they'd never bothered to understand. As I drove back to my hotel that evening, I felt the same mix of sadness and liberation that I'd experienced after Grandma Rose's funeral. Sad that my family relationships had been so fundamentally broken for so long, but liberated from the weight of trying to earn approval from people who had never taken the time to know what they were approving. The legal victory was satisfying, but the personal vindication was transformative. For the first time in my adult life, I felt completely free from the need to prove myself to people whose opinion had been based on ignorance rather than observation. Grandma Rose had left me more than money. She'd left me validation, independence, and the confidence that comes from knowing that at least one person in my family had seen me clearly and loved what she saw. But the story wasn't over yet. What happened in the months following the trial would prove that sometimes winning in court is just the beginning of a much larger transformation. 6 months after the trial, I was sitting in my Seattle office reviewing a cybersecurity proposal for a major tech company when my assistant buzzed me with an unexpected call. Sophia, there's someone named Dr. Patricia Williams from Riverside University online too. She says it's about establishing a scholarship fund. I picked up the call, curious about what Riverside University could possibly want with me. Dr. Williams introduced herself as the dean of the computer science department and explained that she'd followed the news coverage of my family's inheritance case. Ms. Chen, we're reaching out because we'd like to discuss a partnership opportunity. We understand that you've inherited a substantial estate, and we're hoping you might consider establishing a scholarship program for students pursuing cybersecurity studies. The irony wasn't lost on me. 6 months earlier, my parents had been arguing in court that I didn't deserve Grandma Rose's money. Now, institutions were approaching me to help distribute that money in ways that would honor her values and continue her legacy of supporting education and public service. I'm interested, I told Dr. Williams. But I'd want any scholarship program to reflect specific principles: merit-based selection, support for first-generation college students, and emphasis on using technology skills for social benefit rather than just personal enrichment. That sounds exactly aligned with our department's mission, she replied enthusiastically. Over the following weeks, I worked with Riverside University to establish the Rolex Chen Memorial Scholarship for Cybersecurity Excellence. The program would provide full tuition support for students who demonstrated both technical aptitude and commitment to using their skills for protecting others rather than just maximizing profit. The scholarship announcement made local news, which led to an unexpected phone call from someone I hadn't heard from since the trial. "Sophia, it's Kevin." My brother's voice carried a humility I'd never heard before. "I saw the news about the scholarship program. It's exactly something Grandma Rose would have loved. That was the idea. Listen, I know things ended badly after the trial, and I know Dad and Mom made terrible mistakes. But I've been thinking a lot about what you said about family being a choice you make every day." I waited for him to continue, unsure where this conversation was heading. "I want to try," he said quietly. "I want to try to actually know my sister instead of assuming I know who you are based on old ideas about success and family roles." Over the next few months, Kevin and I began rebuilding a relationship based on who we actually were rather than who we'd been expected to be. He visited Seattle, met my colleagues, saw my work environment, and began to understand the career I'd built. I learned about his struggles with living up to family expectations, his own questions about whether traditional success markers actually led to fulfillment. My parents, however, remained distant. They'd sent a formal apology letter through their attorney, probably advised by Whitmore as damage control, but they made no genuine effort to understand what had gone wrong or to rebuild our relationship on different terms. A year after the trial, I received a call that my father had suffered a heart attack. Kevin called from the hospital, asking if I would come. I flew to Riverside that night, not because I felt obligated, but because I realized that regardless of our relationship issues, I didn't want to live with regret about unfinished business. When I walked into his hospital room, my father looked smaller than I remembered, vulnerable in a way that reminded me he was human rather than just the distant authority figure from my childhood. "Sophia," he said weakly, "thank you for coming. How are you feeling?" Like an old fool who wasted too many years not knowing his own daughter. We talked for an hour, really talked, perhaps for the first time in my adult life. He asked about my work, my life in Seattle, my relationship with Grandma Rose. He listened without interrupting, without offering business advice, without trying to redirect the conversation toward topics he understood better. "I've been thinking about what you said after the trial," he told me. "About how we never asked, never tried to understand who you really were. You were right. We were so focused on what we thought success should look like that we missed the success you were actually achieving." My mother visited during my 3-day stay in Riverside, and while our conversation was more stilted, she also made genuine efforts to understand my career and my choices. For the first time, she asked specific questions about my government work, my congressional testimony, and my consulting practice. "I watched your Senate hearing online," she admitted. "Twice. I had no idea that you had become someone so accomplished and respected." "I've been accomplished and respected for years, Mom. The only thing that changed was your awareness of it." She nodded, tears in her eyes. "I know. And I'm sorry it took a public trial for us to see you clearly. Those conversations didn't magically repair 3 decades of misunderstanding, but they opened a door to something different." Over the following months, we began building new relationships based on who we actually were rather than who we'd assumed each other to be. My father recovered fully from his heart attack and, surprisingly, began asking for my advice on business technology issues. My mother started sending me articles about cybersecurity that she'd found interesting, along with thoughtful notes about why they reminded her of my work. But the most meaningful change came 2 years after the trial, when my parents called to ask if they could attend the first Rolex Chen Memorial Scholarship Award ceremony. "We'd like to honor her memory," my father said. "And we'd like to see what you've built with her legacy." Standing in the Riverside University auditorium, watching 5 brilliant young cybersecurity students receive full scholarships funded by Grandma Rose's inheritance, I felt the deep satisfaction of having used her gift exactly as she would have wanted. The scholarship recipients were diverse in background but united in their commitment to using technology skills for protecting others. They reminded me of myself at their age, passionate about cybersecurity's potential to create a safer, more secure world. During my speech at the ceremony, I talked about Grandma Rose's belief that privilege carries responsibility, that success without service is meaningless, and that the greatest legacy anyone can leave is investing in the next generation's ability to solve problems and protect society. These scholarships honor a woman who understood that love is demonstrated through action, that family is built through choice rather than obligation, and that the greatest gift we can give is helping others discover their own potential for excellence. My parents sat in the audience, and for the first time in my memory, they looked proud of me for reasons that had nothing to do with traditional markers of success. They were proud because they finally understood who I was and what I valued. After the ceremony, my mother approached me with tears in her eyes. "Your grandmother would be so proud," she said. "Not just of your success, but of your character. She saw something in you that we missed for too long." "She saw someone who valued relationships over obligations," I replied. "Someone who measured success by impact rather than income. Someone who understood that the greatest inheritance isn't money, it's principles." 5 years after the trial, I'm still running my cybersecurity consulting firm, still protecting companies and infrastructure from digital threats, still testifying before Congress on emerging security challenges. But I'm also administering a scholarship program that has supported 50 students in pursuing cybersecurity careers focused on public service. My relationship with my family isn't perfect, but it's real in ways it never was before. We talk regularly, visit meaningfully, and engage with each other as complete people rather than playing predetermined family roles. Most importantly, I've learned that sometimes the greatest gift someone can give you isn't money or opportunity, it's the courage to become exactly who you're meant to be, regardless of what others expect or assume. Grandma Rose left me $2.8 million, but her real legacy was teaching me that love is earned through presence, that respect is built through consistency, and that the most valuable inheritance anyone can receive is the confidence to live according to their own principles rather than other people's assumptions. That's not just a happy ending, it's a blueprint for building a life worth inheriting. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt underestimated or misunderstood by people who should have known better, remember that your worth isn't determined by other people's recognition. Sometimes the greatest validation comes not from changing minds, but from staying true to your principles until the right people notice. Thank you for following this journey. Remember to subscribe and share your own stories in the comments, because the best families are the ones we choose through mutual respect, consistent presence, and unconditional support. The truth about inheritance isn't about money, it's about values. And the greatest gift you can give or receive is the freedom to become exactly who you're meant to be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.